Good morning. Welcome to the last session for this morning. Looks like we got a very interested crowd. My name is Denny Mullen. I represent the local AFCEA section and a volunteer here. And I got to give the AFCEA sales pitch too. I've been a member for 56 years. I think I'm the oldest member in the local chapter. For you young people out there that are not members, I would encourage you to consider it. If you are a member of AFCEA, you automatically get credit for attending the session. Otherwise, you have to self-certify. And I don't know if you knew that or not, but in my own career, AFCEA has always been special to me. I have volunteered in many locations when my 26 years in the Army. And like any volunteer organization, what you get out of it is what you put into it. And so if you want to talk more about that, I can talk about AFCEA. But today's not about AFCEA. This is about Zero Trust. Couple of announcements, and you've probably gotten accustomed to this already this morning, but the session is recorded. And so when we get the question and answers, the question's going to come on the mic. I'll run you down with the mic. We want to make sure we get that as part of the discussion. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn it over to our guest to introduce himself, and we'll be on with the show.
Thank you. How's the sound in the back? Look good? All right, awesome. So I'm Rich Johnson. I'm a principal sales engineer with Zscaler. I've been with Zscaler now about 6.5 years, but I've been working with federal, primarily DoD, for about the last 35 years. So happy to be here today to talk with you about what I think is a really, really important topic. That is Zero Trust being the key to non-kinetic dominance in a multi-domain theater. And that's obviously a mouthful to say. So really quickly, what is non-kinetic dominance? So non-kinetic is the use of non-physical methods to achieve a strategic objective. Examples of this might be things like cyber attacks, disinformation, economic coercion. These approaches rather than a direct physical attack. So it's usually done to manipulate perception, maybe to change the outcome of events. We've seen this has really evolved over the last 25 years or so. And so as we go through this, I want you to focus and really think about all the ways in which cyber is being used today, both from an offensive side as well as a defensive side, and why a non-kinetic warfare is taking so much more importance than it used to in the past. In contrast to non-kinetic, my accident this morning, 2 blocks from here, was a perfect example of kinetic, and definitely not non-kinetic, but everybody walked away unscathed, and so happy to be here with you today to actually give this presentation. A few bumps and bruises, might be a little sore later on. But it stood as a great example of contrast. I didn't do it on purpose to kind of show the difference between kinetic versus non-kinetic. So today we're going to be focusing on non-kinetic aspects. Speaking of which, you would have to have had your head buried in the sand for the last 20 years to not realize all the cyber attacks and cyber events that have been going on around the world. Obviously, a few years ago, we had the SolarWinds breach, and that made the press. Earlier this year, the U.S. Treasury Department had computers accessed by the Chinese through a supply chain attack. And one of the ones that I often think back to, the one that stands out the most to me was way back in 2010, when TechNet was used to compromise and take out the Iranian nuclear facility. And that is typically credited as being the first use of cyber as a weapon. And what's really interesting about that event, it made the news. Everyone talked about it. It was on 60 Minutes and many news stations. But it was a very skillfully put together a piece of software. It wasn't just your, script kiddies doing something that happened to hit the Iranian facility. It was targeted at the Iranians. Specifically, they looked at the location of where that was dispersed, and it was predominantly in that region. The second thing was that the software was specifically designed to target Siemens PLCs that were being used within nuclear reactors. So it was very, very bespoke in nature. It wasn't just a broad thing spot out there. They obviously, had it been knocking out other smaller systems, then that would have created an awareness. And so it was intelligently designed to go after a specific type of system, and it was very effective. I don't know that anyone has ever taken credit fully for that particular piece of cyber warfare, but obviously there's some obvious key players that could be involved in that type of thing, which really brings to mind, how did this all get started? We've been using bullets and bombs for hundreds of years, bows and arrows, millennia ago. How did cyber become a weapon? And what should we be doing about it? And should we be concerned? Well, with Stuxnet, the whole world all of a sudden became concerned, because all of a sudden, this took out an Iranian reactor, and we applauded that. That's great. But what about someone using that against us? Taking out our power grid, tampering with shipping supplies. What about someone hitting our water systems? So there's ways that this can affect us, even tampering with elections, or being used as a weapon to disrupt our economy. So this is something we can't ignore. It's something that it's in our face and very real and present danger. So when I think back to my earlier days in computer science, when I graduated from the University of Maryland way back in 1985, this is what I consider the good old days of computing, what we think about the blind era of trust. And I say blind era of trust because from the 40s to the 80s, nobody thought about cybersecurity. It was all about just getting on, programming the computer, getting your results, and understanding, using computers for useful, good purposes. But at that period of time, the idea of connecting computers together in any meaningful way was still relatively new. ARPANET was being used, ARPANET being obviously the predecessor to today's internet, but it was being used to connect universities together. Federal organizations were a part of that. At that point, back in the early 80s, it was illegal to actually use the internet for commercial use cases. So it was all research and development. Obviously, that all changed. And with that, all of a sudden, the world became vastly connected. It's becoming more and more connected all the time. TCP/IP was an emerging protocol. There was a lot of protocols that came before it, but this one seemed to really start to tie a lot of different systems together. So in the era of the blind trust, we really relied on physical security to provide us our protection. The thought was, well, if I'm inside of my physical barrier, I've got fences around the outside of my perimeter, I should be safe. Our computers were tied to mainframes via terminal lines, serial communication. So networking was still at its early infancy. And as often is the case, one computer science researcher got this bright idea. He wanted to prove that, self-replicating malware was something that could actually be achieved. And so this engineer from BBN set out and actually developed the first self-replicating computer malware, which typically you think of as a virus, a computer virus. And he published his papers on how he accomplished this. And of course, once you publish something, it's like putting something on the World Wide Web on how to build a bomb. Everybody else said, oh, that's a really cool idea. Let me do that. I remember writing my first Trojan horse back in the early 80s to kind of thwart my colleague who kept taking my computer and logging into it so he could do his job. So, once this got out and people started figuring out how to use these pieces of software, it started really spreading and became prevalent. And then we start to see that, things like Brain Boot Sector and Love Letter were popping up and causing problems, not just for a group of people, but for a large number of people. So at this point in time, we realized that cyber threats were real and something we had to start to account for. And so I've got a timeline. I obviously won't read through all of these. You'll get these slides if you want them. These are just a tip of the iceberg of significant threats that have occurred. I've already talked about 2010, the Stuxnet worm. But in 2015, there was a spear phishing attack on the DoD. Obviously, in 2016, we had PetYa, and then followed on by NotPetya. In 2017, we had WannaCry. 2020, we had the SolarWinds breach. In 2021, the very famous Log4j attack that was out there. So these different types of security breaches and malware and things like ransomware, they're not going away. So we have to be ready and be on the guard to defend against these things, because otherwise nation-state actors around the world will use them against us. And so as we left the era of blind trust and now realized that there was a real problem we had to deal with, we entered into what I call the era of naive trust. And for many ways, we're just coming out of this era. But the thing about the era of naive trust was we realized there was a problem, but we thought we were still could handle it, get our arms around it. If we could just secure the computers and devices that we attach to our safe networks inside of our perimeter, then we would be okay. And this network-centric approach really lasted for several decades. I mean, this is what I grew up in. So how do you protect your environment? It's, go talk to the network team. They will put together firewalls. They'll put an IPS, an IDS, or other things in the system. And defense in depth became the norm. So this is how we were going to stop the bad guys. The problem was the bad guys weren't always on the outside. And sometimes the bad guys weren't even aware that they were bad guys. They were just people that were compromised. And so the human element became the primary target for advanced persistent threats in the modern world. At Zscaler, we examine all these threats across our global cloud. We're processing about 500 billion transactions a day. And as such, we get to see a lot of traffic from all over the planet, from all sorts of different sectors. And things like computer vulnerabilities, like in software and browsers, that's really shrunk dramatically over the last 10 years. Now the target is people. It's really going after social engineering and social behavior and getting people to click on a link or answer a phone call and divulge information. And so that's the thing we really have to deal with. And unfortunately, just hardline network security isn't always going to take that into account and be able to adapt to that. And also, you also have insider threats. Obviously, people like Snowden, opened up a whole nother can of worms of things that we have to be looking for. And now we have to actually start to study individual behavior. What are they doing? Are they doing things out of the norm? And we have to use this as intelligence and feed this back into the system. And this is where zero trust, in my mind, really changes the game. Because in the old traditional defense in depth, as I mentioned before, everything was like little barriers that you'd have to go through. But the problem with these different gates is that none of them talk to each other. So if I got past the firewall, then hopefully my IPS IDS system would catch it. If it got all the way to my desktop, hopefully my antivirus software running on my computer would catch it. But nothing was talking to each other. And so we didn't get this holistic view of what was going on within an environment. And zero trust changes that. Zero trust is all about all these different partners in this ecosystem working together. So we came out of the era of blind trust and into naive trust, and finally now into the era of zero trust. Zero trust is all the buzzword. Everybody is talking about zero trust. I am talking about zero trust today. But zero trust kind of gave us this big wake-up call. We realized that traditional approach of network-centric security wasn't going to cut it anymore. We kept putting Band-Aid on Band-Aid on Band-Aid, trying to solve it from a network perspective, and it simply was not going to be enough to address the problem. We had to start with a brand new ground zero when it came to cyber. And so after a lot of different discussions and forums, the NIST put together special publication 800-207 to kind of codify, hey, this is what zero trust is. We've been talking about it for a while, but this is what we're talking about, specifically from a federal perspective. Now, zero trust itself really isn't a new thing. The term is kind of new, but the idea has really started way back in the early 2000s with the Jericho Forum. And there are a lot of projects like the DoD's DISA's Black Core. Google formed the Beyond Corp and try to apply these principles. So it's actually an old idea that has finally reached the time, that point in time where technology caught up with the idea where we could actually start to implement this in a real and meaningful way. And so with NIST publishing their zero trust publication, now we had identify these 5 pillars. They broke up 5 pillars, the device, the user, the data, the network and the application, and they used things like analysis and logging and orchestration and automation as foundational elements. Now, the DoD took that and looked at them all as simply just being pillars. Simplified this a little bit, and we'll talk about the differences, within that. But ultimately, we're all talking about the same thing. So it doesn't matter whether you're on the civilian side of the house looking at CISA and these 5 pillars and foundational elements, or on the DoD and Intel side, which looks at the 7 pillars. We're all talking about the same elements. So as I mentioned, NIST special publication 800-207 came out. Extremely important. Everything is building on that. If you haven't read that document, then it's really foundational to understanding the principles behind zero trust. By now, everyone realizes that zero trust is really a strategy. It's not a product. You just can't go buy zero trust from Zscaler or Microsoft or AWS or anybody else that's out there. There's a lot of marketware that might suggest you can, but reality is it's not. It's a pretty complex project to undertake. And because it touches all those different pillars. So it's not enough to implement zero trust in one of them. You have to implement zero trust across all of them. CISA came out and gave us their zero trust maturity model, which really helps a lot because it kind of gives us a roadmap, if you would, on how to get started, how to progress through these various stages, and how to reach a maturity model at some point in the future. The reality is, especially in the federal government, there's not a lot of greenfields out there anymore. Typically, we're working in a brownfield environment of one type or another. So as such, we have to be able to go into those systems without breaking them, without turning them off, and start to adapt them and transform them over time. This takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. And so even after the CISA put out their maturity model, there was still a lot of confusion. Obviously, President Biden put out a mandate that all federal agencies, including the intelligence community, must adopt and implement a zero trust architecture. Well, that's great. How do we do that? So DoD, Portfolio Management Office for Zero Trust, came out with their zero trust strategy. So this was a big step for the DoD because DISA had already put out their zero trust reference architecture, which helped. It added more color, but it was still very philosophical in nature. With the zero trust strategy from OSD, now we had they took those 7 pillars and codified 45 distinct capabilities that they felt were critical to be able to implement zero trust within the Department of Defense. Now, if you look at these across these pillars, I won't go through all 45 of them, but you're going to see some commonalities for users, data, applications. This idea, let's figure out what's out there. Let's create an inventory of all the different things, all the different assets that are there. In the case of users, multi-factor authentication, continuous access, the ability to do privileged access management, elevated privileges. All these types of things became really important and understood in terms of being the necessary component for these zero trust for devices. Device posture, what devices do I have on my network? What OSs are they running? What vulnerabilities do they have? How secure are they? Are they running like a local firewall? Things of that nature. So we have a lot about the devices. I will say this is probably the area that the DoD was farthest along in. This whole notion of comply to connect has been out there on the DoD for quite a while. So they were way down the road on the device side of the house. They've been working on an ICAM project for 10 years now. So that's, they're getting there. That's, I think when Zero Trust came out, it kind of, in many ways was a little bit of a setback for the ICAM programs because now all of a sudden now they had to make sure that they were Zero Trust compliant as well. But applications and workloads, what applications are out there? If you've ever been around a large DoD, especially Army data center like Redstone Arsenal, you know that there's a lot of application sprawl out there. No one knows all the applications that are still out and running in these networks, thousands of them. So application rationalization has been a project on everybody's agenda for quite a long time now. So if you don't know it's out there, you've got a vulnerability waiting to happen. So one thing is identify the applications and just make sure that they're developed in a mode that has security up front, not as an afterthought. And then we get to my favorite one, which is data. Data is by far the least mature in the industry, and yet it's the most critical. If you ask anybody, they're going to tell you, we want a data-centric zero trust architecture. We don't want a network-centric architecture, we want a data-centric architecture. Great, what does that mean? What does that mean, really? And everyone, not just the DoD, but everyone's been struggling with this one. Okay, so we need to identify the data. There's several different types of data. We got structured data, things like databases. We have non-structured data, files, and then semi-structured data. So different types of data. And there are companies popping up that does A or B, maybe C, but finding a company that's really strong in all of them can be very, very challenging. We know we need to be able to figure out the data itself and understand, is it classified, non-classified? What parts of it are sensitive or unsensitive? Who should use this data? So identifying and tagging this data, labeling this data and tagging it so that it can be enforced at some point is the biggest challenge. Coming up with a consistent labeling architecture, right now, pretty much what I'm seeing across Army, Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps, they're all doing their own thing. They've given up on waiting for big, brother DoD to come up with a standard. And so they're all off on their own projects, which is great. They're going to have systems that will work within their environment. It's not going to help so much for cross-domain so much, but at least it's a start. And at some point down the road, we can have a unified DoD model that everyone will move to and adopt to. But even though it's the most important, it is the least mature, and so expect that that's going to be the one that's going to be kind of the long pole in your tent as you start going after these projects. On the far side, networking. I can't help but notice that network is the shortest of the list. So what a shift from the old days of network centricity when we were going to try to solve all these problems by breaking up our network into distinct little VLANs and then trying to control which users could get to which VLANs. We've all seen what happens with that. That's great until you go TDY and you're someplace on the other side of the country or the other side of the world and you can't get to the data that you need because you're in the wrong VLAN. So that model just doesn't scale for the DoD. And so you can see the shift. All of a sudden it's getting much smaller, less focus on network. It's still important. Software-defined networking becomes much more important in this modern world because it can adapt and be changed on the fly. Then we get to orchestration and automation and logging and analysis. Still very, very important. I won't go into all the details from a time perspective, but you can see all the different things that we have to work on when it comes to zero trust. And again, you're going to find that you're going to be at different levels of maturity in each of these pillars as you start these projects. So we went from 7 pillars to 45 capabilities. Where Randy Resnick and his team were hard at work, and they gave us the either famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, fan chart. So they've then taken those 45 capabilities and came up with 152 activities that are necessary to achieve zero trust inside of the DoD. 91 target, and by target, the idea there was these are the ones that we need to do right away if we're going to secure our infrastructure, our data, our assets from known threats. Forget the emerging threats. This is just the things that we know that are out there today. If we can do these activities and achieve these outcomes, we'll be ahead of the game and we'll be able to stop the adversaries. And then there's an additional 61 that we want to achieve at some point in time because these will help us address emerging threats. And all of these documents are publicly available. So if you haven't read them, I strongly encourage you to do so. They can be a little long, a little dry at times, but they definitely take the idea of zero trust and codify it in a way that you actually has some teeth to it, something you can actually grab onto and actually start to implement and get after. I will say, as a vendor, I am so sick and tired of hearing about the 152 activities. So as always, what happens, something good gets turned on its head and used for something bad. These 152 activities are not a checklist, okay? I will always be asked, well, how many of these activities do you cover? Or how many of these activities does your partner cover? If I put you and you and you and you together, how many do you cover? All right, that's the wrong focus point. I can check off all 152 activities and still not achieve zero trust. The activities isn't the important thing. The outcomes are what's important, okay? So if you take nothing away from this talk, take that away. The outcomes are what's important. I've watched systems integrators go through and look at 100 different disparate tools that an organization is using and saying, yes, we've checked the box. We're zero trust. We're good to go. They can't achieve the outcomes. Why? Well, part of it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago. The systems have to talk together. They can't operate in silos independently. They do, you're never going to achieve the outcomes that are here. The other problem that I have with zero trust is this notion of zero trust itself. Well, zero trust is a strategy. So if someone says, what's your zero trust strategy? My response is, or question back is, to what? There's a different zero trust strategy for tactical than there is for enterprise. There's a different zero trust strategy for remote users than there are for people that are on-prem. There's a different zero trust strategy you have to implement for workload to talk to workload inside of a data center. There's a different zero trust strategy you need to implement to create an ecosystem where you have software-defined or software workshops where you can actually have software and reaching out to libraries and pulling in new repositories. All of these things require a zero trust strategy that is applicable to them. So there's no one size that fits all. So when you look at these activities, some of them are more applicable to enterprise. In fact, Randy's team will be the first to say that, yeah, we kind of missed the boat on tactical with these. There's a whole nother set for tactical that aren't even listed here, okay? So just realize that this is going to be evolving and it's going to be adapting to address specific needs within the Department of Defense. Now I'm going to step into a quagmire of get myself in trouble because this is a little bit of blasphemy to say in front of a zero trust audience, but zero trust is not the end goal. It really isn't. Zero trust is simply the state that we need to reach so that we can start building proper communication channels, okay? Let me say that again. Zero trust is the state we need to reach. We can't do it from blind trust. We certainly can't do it from naive trust. We need to start at zero trust, okay? Once you've cleared the deck, and honestly, we're never going to truly reach 100% zero trust, right? You got some elements have to be there, but get as close as you can. But once you've leveled that new ground zero for cyber, now we can build on that. We can build a framework on top of that. And when we do that, we will reach a point that I call verified trust. And it's not a new buzzword. Don't go talk about verified trust. It's really just a natural outcome of implementing the zero trust process. But I think some people get caught up in the term zero trust. How does zero trust work? You can't do anything at zero trust. And I totally agree. At the point of zero trust, no effective communication can really occur. Imagine if you walked into your bank and you were going to operate in a mode of zero trust. And the first thing you do, you walk up to the teller and you say, hey, I want to do a withdrawal. And they're going to say, well, what's your account number? Whoa, wait, I'm not giving you my account number. Are you crazy? You know what you can do with my account number? You trying to steal money from me? And they're like, okay, calm down, Rich. Can I see your driver's license? Whoa, not my driver's license. You know how much personal information I got on my driver's license? Not a chance. I would never give out that information to somebody on the street. So why would I give it to the person at the bank? Well, when I walked into that bank, number one, I made a conscious decision to step into that bank. It had my bank's name on it. I stepped into it. It looks like a bank. It's locked down like a bank. It looks like a brick and mortar bank. I've got this lady behind the window, this big thick glass. It looks like a bank. Okay, she's got a name tag on. It looks like an employee. So unless they're all in it together, there's a pretty good confidence that this is really a bank. Plus, I found this bank's address on my bank's website. So I've got a verified, trust in that teller that I can give her my information that I would not give, anyone on the street, and that I'm not going to be compromised as a result of that. So verified trust is extremely important. And the level at which we can verify the entity with which we're communicating with changes the level of sensitivity that we can disclose. Another aspect of this whole idea of trust by verification is continuous assessment. So as I mentioned, zero trust is the starting point you must achieve to progress to verified trust. And if you try to shortcut that, as we've done for decades now, you're never going to reach the end point of verified trust that you need to operate securely, especially with insider threats as well as all the events, persistent threats that are out there. But once you achieve some level of verified trust, it's not enough to just do that one point in time. You've got to continuously reassess the people that you're working with, the entities that are involved, because they change. Nothing is constant except for change. So my computer this morning may have been fine when I first turned it on, but a dormant piece of malware wakes up at 11 o'clock and starts rewriting my presentation as I'm up here. So you don't know what's going on all around you. Maybe, I got a call an hour ago and I'm going to get fired, I found out. And so now I'm a disgruntled employee and I start doing things start trying to collect information. Things are changing constantly. So we have to constantly be reassessing the things around us. Thinking that you can just check things once and be good is kind of like, going to the airport and thinking that you should be able to pass through security just because you were there last week or even yesterday. I flew down to Augusta last week, was on the same set of flights, went to the same checkpoints, had the same flight crew even. But guess what? When I arrived at the airport, I was in a state of zero trust. Speaking of which, TSA is actually my favorite example when I give for what is zero trust. So as I mentioned, when you do arrive at the security checkpoint, you are in a state of zero trust, but it wasn't always this way. If I roll the clock back 24 years to August 2001, our airports were operating in a state of naive trust. Let's think about that. I could show up at the airport, as long as I could pass through the metal detector, I could make my way down to the gate and wait for my spouse or my children to arrive on their plane. I didn't need a ticket. I didn't need any valid reason for being there. I could just do it because I wanted to go watch airplanes land, okay? Obviously, September 2001 changed everything. TSA was formed, and over the span of time since then, they've gone about implementing what I think is one of the best examples of zero trust in the industry. So when you arrive at that checkpoint, they don't trust anything about you, nothing. So they're going to first say, hey, provide me with valid ID. And those old school driver's license, they're not going to cut it anymore. You either need a passport or a real ID driver's license. Next, they're going to facial scan you now. A lot of that's becoming quite the norm at most major airports. They do this really more for expediency. It's faster, more accurate. So they're putting these things in to try to speed up the process as well. You got to have a valid reason for being there. If my ticket said, yes, I've got a flight to Augusta next week, they would have laughed at me and told me to get lost. Okay, so I needed to have a valid reason to be at that checkpoint. Next, they're going to scan my person. They do a full scan, maybe a metal detector, maybe a full imaging scan. They scan my bags. Okay, they're making sure that there's nothing nefarious in my bag. I don't have a gun. I don't have a knife. I don't have so much liquid that is suspicious. And if you're that lucky person, you might get pulled out of line and be randomly searched additionally for additional screening. Post-checkpoint, you are recruited into the TSA in a somewhat kind of indirect way because I'm sure you've all heard the see something, say something slogan. So they want you to participate in helping them keep the airports safe and secure. If 1,000 people go through the checkpoint with 3 ounces of liquid, but then meet up and combine those, now you could have the makings for a bomb, right? So if you see something like this happening, you need to say something to somebody, alert something, all right? Some airports even restrict which gates you can get to based upon your ticket. So I'm down in Orlando, is it? No, that's actually Tampa. So the E gates over here, the A gates over there, I've got to scan my boarding pass first before I can even get to the right gate. And then when you get to the gate itself, that gate agent is going to look at your ticket to make sure that you're getting on the right plane, not just any old plane. So verified trust. Now, when we think about TSA, we typically think about passengers, but that's not all that the TSA is there for. They're not just looking at passengers. They also are verifying the crews, the service crews that are out there, the vendors that are loading things onto the planes. Everybody is scrutinized. And that's very true and similar to what we do inside of Zero Trust in our environments. So Zero Trust isn't just for Rich, logging in remotely into his computer or connecting into the network. No, it's also about applications talking to applications. It's also about things like OT and IoT that need to talk to other servers. Zero Trust must apply to all of these different components. Application programming interfaces. If you think a person can do damage, think about what an API can do. A rogue computer that has API access can change your whole network and security model in a matter of seconds if it has the right credentials and API programming models. So that almost goes unnoticed. No one thinks about APIs, but that's a big danger point, that we have to have API gateways that are scrutinizing API calls that are being made across our environment. So I've talked a lot about security, but security has to be balanced with performance. There's this constant tension that always exists between security and end user experience. Technologies need to work together, leveraging things like the shared signal framework so that they can work smarter and more intelligently. Machine learning is another place that can really play into this and make this a lot more smooth. I remember when I was working at my previous company and the regional security stacks were rolled out across the DoD. I was instantly called in for a fire team effort down at Redstone Arsenal because inadvertently they had broke a lot of applications. And it happens. Security, if it's not implemented properly, can cause some major disruptions. You can basically DDoS your own network and compromise your own missions, just like an advanced nation-state actor could. So we have to always be looking at how can we balance and have optimal security, but without compromising end-user experience. Okay. Now we start talking about things like scale of the DoD. So cloud becomes a big important factor in doing that. But we have to also then deal with cloud and on-premises issues. So sometimes you have to be able to operate even when the cloud's not available. So architecting these solutions is very critical, which brings me to my second phase of this presentation, which is staying focused on what really matters. Because I mentioned before, you can get really caught up in activities, but outcomes and objectives are much more important, which is where Mr. Resnick's team stepped in again and produced their last document that they produced in this series, which was the Department of Defense Zero Trust Overlays. I think this is the most important document that they put together because it really brings into focus the context. Anyone who's ever done an ATO knows that context is king. Yes, you might be able to use that device in this context, but not in this context over here. So much the same way, the overlays give us a really good understanding of, okay, this is the outcome in this particular context that I want to implement. And yes, these activities get me there, but I got to make sure that I'm not just checking the box, but also ensuring that I'm achieving my goals. So one of the things that I always like to encourage people, they ask, well, where do I start? I will always say this: start with identity. The reason I think so, in Zscaler, we're not an identity company, but to me, identity is the core of your zero trust architecture. If you get this wrong, the rest of it is going to be compromised. And identity is much more than just usernames and passwords. It's much more than just multi-factor authentication. We access dozens of applications each and every day, some of them in the cloud, some of them on our local environment. If we had to log in to each application with username and password every single time we used it, it would drive productivity through the floor. So we need to be smart and intelligent in the way that we access these applications. And modern identity providers do that. And there's several of them out there, quite a few that are FedRAMP accredited, and they're widely adopted across the DoD today. But it has to be to account for SaaS applications that are out there. And it's got to use either things like OAuth or SAML or ODIC type of mechanisms to be able to allow you to have a non-proprietary means of authenticating with all these different applications. It's got to be able to federate with all the different systems that are out there. As an example of that, it's going to be able to federate with your on-premises devices, because if you have a localized identity source and you lose connection to the cloud, you've still got to be able to authenticate. And you want those things to always be in sync with each other. It's got to work with your IaaS and your PaaS solutions and your on-premise servers. Okay, so it's got to be able to integrate and be used by your CASB solutions to ensure that your cloud security is where it needs to be. It should be working hand in hand with your mobile device management and your EDRs and XDR solutions. And as I mentioned before, API gateways. Don't do static credentialing for your API solutions. That's just a recipe for disaster. Someone gets those credentials and you've got meltdown on your hands. So you want to lock down APIs more so than probably anything else on the planet. You've got to know, you've got to be able to shut down those credentials if something bad starts to occur. Access control. So software-defined perimeters, they are dependent on things like identity as their means for allowing someone to access an application. You want to restrict not based on IP addresses. IP addresses don't scale. We've seen this, we've tried this. We beat our heads against the wall. You can't lock down access policies on IP addresses. You've got to do it based upon identity. IP addresses are ephemeral, they're changing. And honestly, they can even be spoofed. So you want to tie things to identity that was going to follow the user wherever they might go. In the essence of time, I'm going to move through this one pretty quickly, but what I'll like to say is that yes, identity is the core component of your security fabric, but it has to be highly scalable. It must be extendable to on-premises. APIs must tie into it, and I've mentioned those things already on the previous slide, so let me move on. Continuous assessment, keeping an eye on your assets. So yes, people, workloads, applications, extremely important, but also the devices that they're using. I've already mentioned that a piece of malware can wake up on your device. You may not be running the latest version of software at the right patch levels. So an XDR, EDR solution that you implement is crucial to ensuring that your device complies to connect and that it continues to comply to connect. The device itself is one of the best places to understand what that device itself is doing. What is it trying to reach out to and connect to? Is it doing things that it's never done before? Is it reaching applications it's never seen before? So your EDR-based solution, XDR-based solutions are kind of a cornerstone for you to understand what is that device. And it's not enough for it just to be for laptops or workstations. It's got to be working on your servers on the back end as well. It's got to be able to address your IoT, OT solutions. That's a weak spot. We know that's a weak spot. People are starting to take focus right now and try to figure out how to solve for that. Doing micro-segmentation at the OT, IoT layer. And then finally, it's got to be able to visualize this. You have to be able to look very quickly and determine, are my devices compliant? And more importantly, which ones are not compliant? Which ones do I need to quarantine and lock down until they can be compliant? And I have to share this data. If you start sharing this data with the other members of the Zero Trust ecosystem, it becomes extremely powerful. It's a force multiplier. If you're telling your identity provider that this device is compromised with this user, now I can take action. I can restrict access policies for that user based on that system. I need to be communicating that to my software-defined perimeter so it knows not to allow this device to be able to communicate through that network until somebody mitigates and takes action on this. Which brings me to, how do we limit the attack surface? Okay, let me just build this out really quickly. So limiting the attack surface. So we want to ensure that the individual or the application or whatever it might be, whatever that entity might be, can't directly access the back-end networks themselves. We want to put a broker in the middle of it, a zero trust exchange, and use application connectors to connect everything together. This gives us a point that we could do policy enforcement where we can say, hey, who is this user? Are they authorized to access this particular application? If I use the old school VPNs, we just drop people onto networks. Now I have the ability to look around and see what all I can find. I can start to do reconnaissance on the back end. So we want to limit that. We want to limit the blast radius by connecting workloads, whether it's person or non-person entities, to just specific bespoke applications on the back end based on access permissions. Now you can limit what they can reach. As an engineer, I should not be able to receive my company's financial applications. I shouldn't be able to even ping the server, okay? It should be completely blind to that. All I should be able to see are engineering applications. Likewise, someone that's in the HR department doesn't need to be seeing engineering applications or servers. So restrict people based on the use case. Cloud is needed for scale, but if you're a user sitting on-prem and you're accessing an application that's on-prem, the last thing you want to do is hairpin out to someone's cloud and back again, right? So that's the whole performance thing all over again. So you have to be able to extend that cloud on-premise, and it has to be able to work in that kind of a mode as well. So minimize the attack surface and also eliminate that lateral movement. It's because I can get to one application, I don't want to allow me to hop to that application and then be able to go sideways. Build a slide out really quickly. And it's not just limited to users accessing applications. It also has to do with workloads talking to each other, whether they're in different cloud service providers and private data centers, or even within different VPCs or in the same VPC within a cloud service provider. You need micro-segmentation and macro-segmentation running across these different environments because workload to workload is just as important as user to workload. Likewise, when you have all these diverse, field sites. If you're the Army National Guard and you got, a GFHQ in 50 different states, and you've got to be able to communicate across all these different locations, how do I segment all these locations and protect them? So you have to have a zero trust enabled form of SD-WAN that allows you to connect everything back together. And I've already talked a little bit about the last one, OT, IoT, micro-segmentation down at the network segment. Micro-segmentation is really hard to do. In fact, I would say almost impossible at an enterprise level, but it works really well down at the local area network side, where I have a handful of LANs that I need to be able to micro-segment and say that, hey, this is a sensor. That sensor should not be trying to log into my finance server, right? It should only be able to send data to this collector server on the back end. And if it does become compromised, I don't want it being able to get to everything else on that local area network and spread on that side of the house. I've got all this cloud-based security up here, but if I can stay on my local area network, I've got to secure that east-west as well. Since we're talking about multi-domain, air, space, land, and sea, your architecture, your solution, while it may need cloud as scale, it's also going to be able to adapt to this environment, which means if I lose all communication with the cloud, I need some brain, some local private cloud controller running in that environment that can continue to operate so that new users, new mission partners that are coming into that environment can still be registered, still reach the back-end resources that I've got allocated for them, which means I also need localized versions of my identity provider and localized versions of my SIM so I can continue to capture all that information. And when I go back online and I can connect to the cloud again, all those systems need to then synchronize with the cloud. Seems like the Holy Grail, right? But these things are possible today. We've been implementing these things with other vendors and other organizations for the last 6 months. So things like private cloud controllers are a big step in the right direction. It's a hybrid between pure cloud and pure on-prem. The other one, I know this is Mr. Steve Wallace's favorite thing to ping on, is disparate zero trust islands of communication, okay? Everybody's doing something different. Air Force is doing something different than Army, is doing something different than Navy, doing something different than Marine Corps, who's doing something different than the intelligence community. Everybody's got their idea of what they want to implement. These things have to talk to each other. So make sure that when you're building out a zero trust architecture, that interoperability is something that you're looking at, that you're factoring in. There's a lot of old school technologies like IPsec tunnels that when used properly through a brokered architecture can still operate and allow you to have connectivity. But don't ignore this piece. It will come back to bite you. Data, saved it for last for the most part because data is king. And we want to make sure that our data is being protected. That means it has to be encrypted at rest. It has to be encrypted in flight. We cannot use proprietary algorithms and means to do this, otherwise we lock ourselves into a single vendor solution. So we want to have something that is cryptographically agnostic and that can leverage the DoD's PKI infrastructure. And so this is another area where things like AI and ML can come in and be a big assistance for you. Having humans go out and classify and label the petabytes of data that's out there is almost an impossible task. AI and ML won't do a perfect job, but it will get you a big head start, and now you can then, kind of eat the elephant, so to speak. I've seen a lot of people starting to answer RFIs by throwing it through their ChatGPT and getting the answer from their company's perspective, and then going in and massaging that. apply the same kind of a technique here. So one of the places that you can start to get after the data problem, and then look for solutions that will interoperate with each other. A lot of people are using Microsoft's Purview. It's great. Everyone's using these Microsoft applications, but that's not the only thing that's out there. Probably represents maybe 20% of your application use. So you've got to also be able to address the other 80%. And so you want solutions that will all work together and interoperate together. Reducing complexity, I'll just say that one of the biggest problems we see, whether it's in the cloud or localized private data centers, is misconfiguration. Most of the compromises and challenges arise from misconfiguration. So you need AI and ML to come and be an assistance here as well to help you realize what applications you have and what access policies. If you have 10,000 applications and 10,000 access policies, that's not going to scale. No one can keep track of that. So being able to rationalize that and look for commonality and say, so you know what, we got 10,000 finance application policies, but they all look identical. So we can actually reduce those down to one. That's a big step. So when we look at that, we talked about those applications, part of that, those 45 capabilities, application inventory. Well, if you start to build out your software-defined perimeter and your access policies, don't start from scratch. Import that data and then use that as a starting point to then build access policies. You can start to learn over time who's using these applications. Are they all tied to the same departments? Attribute-based access control is key and critical as we move forward. Role-based we lived that for a long time. It served its purpose, but now we need much more granularity. So attribute-based access controls are critical. And then segmentation insights. So you need to be able to visibly understand users as well as data, as well as networks. And finally, bringing it all together, working smarter by working together. As I mentioned, Zscaler, we have over 500 billion transactions on a daily basis. Over 50 trillion signals are feeding into our backend infrastructure, but that's not enough. That'll get us a long way, but it's still not enough. I need to pull in data from my EDR, XDR partners, from my SIEMs, from my IDP solutions. We can pull all that data in together, and now with all that rich data at our fingertips, we can start to look at the risk exposure for an organization. Even more, we can start to do breach prediction. Based on what we see emerging on the rest of the world and what we see within your organization, I can tell you that within 45 days, you will be compromised in this area. This is an area that you should focus on first and foremost. So this is an emerging area that I'm starting to see pop up in different vendor spaces. We're not the only ones doing this, but it's taking advantage of this massive partner ecosystem to get smarter and work and gather more intelligence and not try to operate in a silo. Operating in silos is a thing of the past. Zero trust is all about sharing data amongst these different systems and being much more effective in how we operate. And with that, I only left us about 5 minutes, but Q&A. And for Q&A, I think our moderator is going to run around with a microphone. If you have any questions, happy to try to address them. I know I'm standing between you and lunch, but also, I'm Rich Johnson.
I have a question.
Fire away.
So this is from personal experience. I know of at least 4 instances where all of my personal information has been compromised. 2 of them were at the physical, what I call the physical layer, which you haven't talked about. That's a human trust part. One of them, an employee took HR database home in his laptop computer, threw it in the back of his car, and stopped at his favorite watering hole on the way home, and it was stolen. That's a physical layer. And the other one was a corporation, which I won't mention, that in their data center, had a very robust data center, an employee took the server physically out of the rack, took it home with all the employee information on it. So in the model, there is this human part, seems to be missing from the discussion. You got any comments on that?
Yeah, so when you look at data, and so physical access is really, really difficult. I know quite a few white hat hackers that I would never want on my home network because physical access is extremely difficult. That's why I talked about the fact that network-centric security really isn't going to cut it anymore. We have to be much more sophisticated. So if the data was encrypted at rest on that devices, then the person who stole that, unless they had developed quantum cryptography abilities, they were not going to break into that and be able to get to your data. But the data, unfortunately, was not being stored encrypted, nor was it being, was probably not even locked down. Probably, the machine itself could be, compromised from a number of different ways. So if whoever was building those systems out were employing zero trust principles, then the devices, whether the server or the laptop, would have been locked down according to these principles we've discussed.
So the data security at rest is extremely important, I guess is the point, even on your own computers.
Yeah, Rich, you mentioned quantum computing. Are you recommending post-quantum cryptography to encrypt your data now instead of waiting till it's required in 2030?
Yeah, I definitely would. Obviously, our adversaries are collecting encrypted data today. They're doing so not so they can break it now, because they can't, but they're doing it so that in 5 years, 10 years, whenever it might be, when quantum computing becomes a reality and commonality in our environment, that they'll be able to then go back and break those keys and get to that data. How much of that data will still be useful and sensitive is not quite clear, but I think as a safeguard, you definitely would, if a vendor offers it, or if they don't, push them to do it, to start implementing, post-quantum cryptography in their solutions. Great question.
So, yeah, Thomas reminded me another one, watermarking. Is watermarking used in any of this concept today?
So
it dates to the Renaissance medieval days in Florence, Italy, where watermarking to validate artist's original work.
So watermarking can be used in a number of different ways. One interesting thing is, as I mentioned, that you're going to have different levels of maturity across those different pillars. And somebody shows up with a laptop that doesn't have the latest patching levels on it. You don't necessarily want to deny all access. What you want to do is adaptively control what they can get to. One thing that you can do is you can browser isolate that traffic. Let's say I'm somebody that does background investigations, and I reach into my backend system and I'm pulling down Rich Johnson's details so I can do his background investigation. Do I want that data, my personal data, on that guy's potentially compromised personal device? Probably not. So what I can do is I can browser isolate that session, and I can even watermark that data so I know who is the user that's accessing that data right now. So that if he did, for example, took a screenshot of that and then tried to exfiltrate that out, at least I would know who it was that did that was part of that compromise. So that's one aspect or a level of watermarking that can be used as a means for tracking.
Other questions?
You mentioned that the data pillar is the least mature of the 7. If data-driven decision making is so critical, why do you find that that is the least mature of the 7?
Yeah, I think it really is just history. And if you roll back 10 years ago, people had a much better understanding of things like networks, and that's why network security is so far along. Device security was already on people's minds. Data level security was seen as a problem that was just too hard. And so we didn't see anyone really getting after that, and especially not in a ubiquitous way that was open and standard space. You would see some proprietary solutions popping out. Adobe was probably one of the first players to get, on a commercial level, to get into doing digital rights management type things and some level of encryption, but it constrained people too much, and they move away from it because it impairs them and restricts them so that they can't get their job done. And so as data exfiltration has become much more aware from a national as well as a worldwide perspective, ransomware, I think people are now aware that, oh my God, data, I've got to protect my data, and how am I going to do that? And so we're scrambling. As an industry, we're scrambling to do that. And it is still a hard problem. As I mentioned, there's structured data. Okay, maybe I can get after it for files on my file system, but what about the database? How am I going to implement? And how do I make that something that is consistent across whether I'm using Oracle or OpenSQL or something else? So I've seen some companies that have done a good job. Happy to talk to you about some companies that I would reference that are doing that, but it is still a challenge. And I think over the next 5 years, it's going to be the biggest growth sector within Zero Trust. Companies are going to be popping out and partnering. You see a lot of acquisitions of these type of companies that are out there. But it's a great question. It's unfortunately, it's just simply time and history wasn't on the side of data. Any other questions?
Anybody else? Thank you very much. Very
Thank you
informative.
all. Appreciate it.
Don't forget to scan on the way out if you're looking for credit.